Is it working? Yes, okay. So as an example, the EU has put in place regional climate policies. So this is its carbon market, for instance, its ETS, the Green Deal that you all know. This creates a risk of carbon leakage when the ambition of different regions and different countries is uneven. So firms can choose to displace their activity and thus displace their emissions, which from a global climate perspective has absolutely no impact since all emission reductions are compensated. So we need to understand how significant this risk is and how we actually deal with it. So to better understand the problem, I will be discussing the 3 different channels that are identified in the literature. So this is the competition channel, the energy channel, and the innovation channel. I'll be presenting the theory and the empirical evidence for each of these channels. So to start us off, the competition channel is the one which is the most discussed in policy circles. And it's the one which is most widely understood when we talk about carbon leakage. So when a climate policy is implemented in a regulated region, this creates additional costs for firms within the regulated region, which puts them at a competitive disadvantage compared to firms that are unregulated in another region. So in the short run, this might make them lose some market shares, and in the long run, they will perhaps decide to leave the region. Both of these dynamics create the same effect, which is that in the regulated region, less emissions are actually going to occur, but in the unregulated region, more emissions occur. So this is the first channel of leakage. The theoretical foundation for non plus. Là, c'est bon? Okay. Sorry about that. So the theoretical foundation for the competition channel is based in game theory. The first papers that talk about it are these papers by Howell and Markussen and others. And in game theory, we find that carbon leakage will always occur because it's always strategically beneficial for firms to actually move to the unregulated country. Empirically, however, in the case of the ETS specifically, it seems that there's no evidence that carbon leakage has occurred for now. This is obviously biased because for now we only have data for the first few phases of the ETS, which have been not very stringent. And so CGE models that are general equilibrium models which look at future pathways and possible trajectories, they tend to predict that more leakage will occur through this channel because carbon pricing will become more stringent and there's going to be more sectors that are actually covered. So it's not a risk yet, but it seems that it could be more so in the future. So that's for the competition channel, which is the first one. But there are 2 others, the first of which is the energy channel. So the way that the energy channel works is that when the regulated region puts in place a climate policy, hopefully it should be reducing its energy demand, and specifically its demand for fossil fuels. Ultimately, this will reduce the demand on global energy markets, which puts a downward pressure on these markets and puts prices down. Because of these lower prices, unregulated firms actually have an incentive to use more of these fossil fuels, which creates more emissions. So this is the second channel of leakage which can occur. Obviously, empirically, this is not possible to study because it's not something that's happened yet. There hasn't been a large shock on energy markets from a climate policy. So it's been exclusively studied in CGE models, so these general equilibrium models that I mentioned. And these point to the fact that there could be a significant risk of leakage. However, it really depends on the parameters that are calibrating these models, and so it should be taken with a grain of salt. And it specifically depends on these parameters that I have here, so the elasticities, substitution possibilities, and we can come back to this in the questions if there's interest. There is one empirical study which is of note, so it's this study by Nittel et al., and they look at the shock of the shale gas revolution. What they find is that coal producers in the United States were actually able to completely replace the domestic demand that disappeared because of this shock. So all the domestic users of coal switched to natural gas, which became a lot cheaper. And they were able to replace it entirely with foreign demand. So this suggests that in this case, 100% leakage is possible, and it happened. Obviously, it's a different context, but it is an indication that we need to bear in mind. Finally, the last channel that I'm going to explain is the innovation channel. And this is a particular channel because it actually works in the opposite way compared to the other two. It creates what we call negative carbon leakage. So the way that it works is that a regulated region will impose a climate policy which improves the environmental performance of its firms, and it creates also the incentive for firms to invest in low carbon research and innovation and create more green innovation. So this can improve their environmental performance, but also some people argue that it improves their productivity as well. This is more debated, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But overall, it's going to reduce the emissions in the regulated country. What happens is if this innovation is actually diffused to unregulated countries, and if they absorb it properly, then they can have the same beneficial effects as in the regulated country. And so this creates negative carbon leakage because only one country imposes a climate regulation, but two countries or regions actually reduce their emissions. So this is a channel that we actually want to maximize when we're implementing carbon leakage policies. To summarize, or actually no, the theoretical foundation for this channel is the Porter hypothesis. CGE models state that it can be a very strong channel for decarbonization, but this is subject to the hypothesis that there's a very strong diffusion that's happening. Empirically, it seems that there is a positive relationship between climate policies and green innovation, and more specifically between the ETS and green innovation. So the first step is validated empirically, but it seems that there's actually a pretty limited diffusion of green technology. Most diffusion occurs between OECD countries, with the exception of some diffusion happening going towards China, but that's almost the only country that is receiving innovation outside of the OECD. So far, there have been no studies looking at the impact of this diffusion in unregulated countries, which makes sense given that it's not a very prevalent dynamic. So to summarize, the competition channel can be a risk, but so far it hasn't materialized. Same for the energy channel. It has a high future risk. The innovation channel is partly validated, but for now, there's no strong diffusion, so this needs to be encouraged. However, there's a very strong political momentum for a carbon border adjustment in the EU, despite the fact that these risks are empirically not entirely validated. So I'm going to explain now what a CBA is and how it can affect each of the three channels that I've presented. So as you all probably know, a CBA is not obviously a new debate. The principle is fairly easy to understand. The principle is to impose the same price of carbon on national and international producers that serve a same market. In practice, this can look, for example, like a border tax imposed on foreign producers that is at the same price as the domestic carbon price. More in depth, there are many different design options for a carbon border adjustment. So there's the type of policy that it can be that can vary. There's the scope, the carbon content calculation, so all of these things. And just to give you one example among many that I could, for carbon content calculation, there are many different options. It is possible to require that each product's carbon footprint is calculated to determine the price that producers will have to pay. It's also possible to use benchmarks. For example, it would be the average of European producers' emissions to create one product. It can also be foreign benchmarks, etc. So there are many different options that obviously have a different administrative burden, but also a different environmental impact. So here, using the carbon footprint of each product is what is environmentally more, going to have a stronger environmental impact, but it's also what's more burdensome from an administrative point of view. So there are options like these for all of the parameters that are here. We can discuss them further, but I'm not going to get into it for time constraints. So how does a CBA actually impact each of the channels that I've presented? With regards to the competition channel, a CBA is by default the tool that is used to impact this channel in particular. So game theory tells us that if the regulated coalition, so the regulated country, has market power in the world, the CBA will actually have a strong impact to reduce carbon leakage. Using more recent calibrated analysis, a paper by Balistreri and others shows really the same results, with the addition that the optimal rate for a carbon border adjustment is actually lower than the domestic Pigouvian tax. And this is because a CBA can actually have a perverse incentive of encouraging more consumption of high carbon goods in the unregulated region. So that's the intuition behind that. Looking at CGE models, they actually seem to indicate that a CBA is not that effective at reducing leakage. On average, studies find that it only reduces leakage by 6 percentage points, which is not huge, but that it does have a stronger impact on carbon-intensive sectors. Finally, there are certain design elements that can improve the way that a CBA acts on the competition channel. So this is by being as detailed as possible. As I said earlier, by using the specific carbon footprint of products, it can be more effective at tackling this issue. Now, with regards to the energy channel, a CBA cannot act directly on this channel. However, there are some studies that point to the fact that it can be used as a strategic tool. So this is one way to go about it is to create a large coalition for carbon pricing and to include a large number of countries within the alliance that imposes the CBA. So for example, this is the EU doing it instead of one single country. Another element that's possible to use the CBA as a strategic tool is to integrate other countries' carbon pricing systems. So for example, this would be Japanese producers that are exporting to the EU who would only pay the difference between the Japanese carbon price and the European carbon price. So that's another way to make it more of an incentive for countries to implement their own carbon pricing. Finally, to impact the innovation channel, a CBA needs to be complemented by additional policy tools. Technology diffusion through trade is very common and empirically proven. And so having a CBA that is really looking at the carbon footprint of products is going to create a stronger market for low carbon products. An additional element that can improve the diffusion of technology is using the revenue from the CBA in an international fund for technological diffusion. So all of these elements kind of show that a CBA can be an effective tool from an environmental perspective, but that this really depends on the way that it's designed and implemented, and that there are a lot of political constraints, of administrative constraints, and so the design elements that I've just summarized here are the ones that I've just presented, so I won't go over them again. Now finally, I'm going to present the EU's proposal for a CBA, what the European Commission has put forward in July of this year. And kind of with all the background in mind that I've just presented, I'm going to review it and give the positive and negative elements. So the way that the Commission is planning on implementing this is by creating a mirror pool of CBAM credits, which are going to be working in the same way as the ETS, where foreign producers will actually be surrendering CBAM allowances every 1 year or after a certain period of time. The products that will be included are those that are covered by the ETS, but not all of them, only those with high carbon intensity and the risk of carbon leakage, and also those that would only impose a low administrative burden. So they're the sectors that you see here on the slides. Carbon content, by default, will be calculated using carbon footprint if the data is available, but obviously this will not be the case for all products. So it'll be also possible to use benchmarks, and specifically regional benchmarks or country benchmarks for specific products. The rate will be at the weekly average rate of ETS allowance prices, and the revenue will only be used for own resources, so it won't be reinvested to a specific, for a specific purpose. In terms of positive elements, the gradual implementation is a very good thing because it allows for a strong collaborative process with other countries that can be used strategically. The fact that the proposal accounts for foreign carbon pricing is also a very positive element, as I mentioned earlier, and the fact that there are also some downstream products that are included. It's not just primary products like steel. There's also byproducts of steel, iron, and aluminum, which allows for sort of mitigating the risk that producers might reshuffle their production and just import or export products that are not covered to avoid the CBA. Limitations, however, are that it doesn't apply to all sectors, which makes sense from an administrative perspective, but from a purely econ and environmental perspective, it does limit the impact that this will have on carbon leakage. It also only includes direct emissions. This is the same thing where administratively it's not possible yet to include more, but for certain sectors like aluminum, for example, where scope 2 emissions are a lot stronger than scope 1 emissions, there's going to be some carbon leakage that passes through unavoidably. The fact that the revenue is also used for EU-owned resources instead of being reinvested in technological diffusion is also sort of a limitation. And finally, the use of benchmarks if carbon footprints are not available is also, as I discussed, a limitation in itself. So I'll conclude now and try to give an overview of everything I've presented. So for now, the risk of leakage is unsubstantiated. It's not something that's materialized, but it's something that is politically very present in debates, and there's a very strong momentum behind the proposal for a CBAM. The CBA could have globally positive impacts on emission levels if it's properly designed and implemented, but there are a lot of questions about the administrative burden, issues also of unequally burdening certain countries, and especially developing countries, and also just the fact that it will be ineffective if it's not designed in a way that puts environmental questions at the front. So now we have a need for really close monitoring of how it's implemented and how it impacts, so trade, obviously, to avoid reshuffling, emissions, to see if leakage is still occurring, and competitiveness patterns, to see how it's actually impacting producers and whether or not it's effectively protecting them from unregulated competition. Remaining questions are the following. There are, of course, many. So we're going to wonder how to avoid trade reshuffling, how to encourage technological diffusion, if other tools should be used to limit leakage, and all of the things that I mentioned throughout the presentation. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think now we'll have the discussion by Jean-Philippe Nicolet. Thank you.
thank you very much, Alina, for your paper. And I'm going to start directly with the first comment. And we will go. There is okay, it will be better. I will say it differently. We will start with the first positive and comments. They will all be quite positive, but after I will challenge and discuss it. I was very happy to read the paper, and it's particularly very well written, very pleasant to read. I read your paper and the EU proposal. Of course, there is a gap in between. It was not so digest as the other one, but I will come back on the EU proposal after all. Of course, the issue is completely topical, and it's very nice to have such a work. Moreover, I think it was just. Maybe you can use the mic. Thank you, Anna. Hello, Cédric. Hello. It was a break. Huh? You just arrived at the good timing. Okay. Then just to go back on the point, I think it was internship work, and it's really impressive, but I will try to give you some recommendation. I think, and everybody has seen that with the slide, your work is very well documented, either on the policy part and also on the literature. However, I would like just to come back on the problem, and we will discuss your paper right after. It's a real issue the EU Commission has to challenge here, but I will rephrase a bit differently than you, and you will see why. The real problem, we have a problem of competitiveness with the ETS, but also the fact that all the countries have not implemented ambitious, sufficiently ambitious regulation. And where you mainly discuss about leakage, I think we have to discuss more on how to reduce the emissions in unregulated countries, more generally. In your paper, you discuss about the two main law issue that we have. One, it is to comply with WTO rules, and mainly the main problem is to use some exceptions that you have in the WTO rules. You have a large discussions, but there are some consensus that it could be possible. But the second problem, and you explain it very well in your paper, it is also with the UNFCCC rules. Since the Paris Agreement, we have a new principle that we have to comply with. It is a common but differentiated responsibility. And it's perhaps one of the main problems, and we will come back on it. Finally, and you have not so much discussed on it, but I think it's really one of the main issues also. It is a problem of informational issues, problems, because it's quite difficult to monitor the carbon content of the foreign products. How much time you have?
About 10 minutes.
Okay.
We'll keep 5 minutes for discussion.
Great. I'm going to make some self-advertisement, sorry. But you will see why and so on. I had a paper with Isabelle Péchou, Jean-Pierre Pansard, and Jérôme Pouillet at some point on this issue. Yes, I presented in front of you at AFSE. Anna was also part of my committee. And so I close the parentheses. And just to come back, you explain in your review, in your literature review, but I think it's the main point here. We have a problem of imperfect competition. The polluting sectors are mainly oligopolistic, and we have to take into account that. All the design, and I think you could go further when you deal with market power issues. all the design have to take into account this problem and what is the value of the import tax that we are going to put. I say it a bit briefly, but all the point is which value for the import tax. And mainly what we show it is that this idea of having an equality, which is a political simplification, but the idea to have the import tax is equal to the carbon tax, theoretically it cannot, it can exist only under perfect competition. And as soon as we have imperfect competition, we have some strategic issues. There are some trade, some strategic trade, and what the main result, it is a very simple message, but what we show it is that there is always some incentives to implement this kind of tax. Put differently, there are always some incentives to manipulate the value. And if you cannot manipulate, if for a political reason you just implement tax is equal to the price, you are going to manipulate with the content, how you monitor the content of the carbon. I close my this self-advertisement, but to come back on your point, and I really think you have a lot of issues you can go with, and you mainly say a bit differently, but I think from a theoretical point, I don't know and, how you are going to invest in this field or not, but I think you have a lot of theoretical questions, such as, should we differentiate across sectors, across countries? Just we have to remind that we have this principle with the NFFCC, and if we have different responsibilities, it means that for developing countries, also we should have different price and so on. And here, perhaps you could, it's just a theoretical proposition, and perhaps you could also try to understand whether it could be interesting to use some transfer to get this differentiation. And perhaps you could design some instruments with the import tax or CBA, it depends how we call that, and the transfer in order to solve the informational problems we have. As you said, there are a lot of different options on the table. The EU Commission proposed 5 different options. And now I'm just going to come back on your paper. As I said, I was very interested, but there is just one point where I'm not completely convinced on your idea to say, okay, the CBA is designed to fight against leakage. It's true, but I would, and you look all the different leakage possible, you just disentangle the effect with the literature, and in the paper you show, for instance, for the 2 last channels, you don't have a lot to say, because the CBA is mainly conceived for competitiveness problems. And if I may give some advice, I would not, with your material, write 1 paper, but perhaps 2 and perhaps 3 papers. Why? I see Mark who is already depressed, sorry. But I think you have really a very nice literature review on the leakage and the effectiveness of ETS, but I'm not so sure that you should use it to discuss of this problem of the design, exactly on the design of the CBA, but I would split the 2 parts and to enter more into the details, more into the 5 options of the EU Commission, and to try to discuss a bit. Finally, your idea to say, okay, we have 3 channels important, I would perhaps more go ahead, but as a computational model, and because here the problem is, in a way, you disentangle a bit the problem and you look at the literature. Perhaps if you are really interested in this issue, something you could do to have a kind of computational model where you will analyze the effectiveness of CBA looking at the 3 channels. But as I said, I was very pleased to read the paper, and congratulations to Aliena.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe, can you reply and we take some questions from the
It's this one, yes. Thank you very much for all of your comments. It was very helpful to get this feedback from someone who has worked on the topic. I very much agree that there's a big difference between obviously what the literature tells us and then what's actually going on in the policy side. And so the price being at the same level as the domestic ETS is one of those things where everything tells us that it should be lower and that there should be differentiations. On the discussion of the common but differentiated responsibility, it's indeed one of the big issues, and it's something that's in negotiations is the main blocking parameter, and so it's maybe something where it's maybe the reason that it's not going to be implemented ultimately. So looking into it is definitely interesting. And then for it's several papers. Indeed, it's very large in the topics that it covers, but that was kind of the intention because there are literature reviews that exist for specific leakage channels, for example, and for specific issues. And the goal was to kind of have an overarching view of what is there. But I do take the point that it could maybe be more specific and oriented towards a more specific question. So I'll look into that. So yeah, thank you very much. And if there are any questions from the audience, I think it would be now that we take them. Yes, please.
I'd like to question about the impact to the customers.
Mm-hmm.
How is this impact? You did not mention it. How is it, and how can we have a compensation system for poorest people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a question about how it impacts consumers and whether there could be something to mitigate the impact on the poorest consumers, and so it's a question about inequality on consumers. So ultimately, it should it will indeed have an impact because it will be blocking imports from highly polluting but ultimately cheaper producers that are foreign. And so right now there have not been many studies actually of the impact that this would have on inequality, but it's maybe something that we can link to studies that have been done on purchasing power just related to climate policies. And so maybe coupling it with something like a redistribution at the EU scale could be possible, but it's not something right now that's discussed in policy circles. But it's definitely very interesting. Thank you. Is there?
Well, there's all the literature on the pass-through that
Yeah.
has been produced
Yeah.
for the first days of the EU ETS. That
Yeah, exactly. And looking at free allocations, for example, there's now evidence that firms were actually able to pass through most of their costs to consumers, and they ultimately were not the ones that were paying. And because of free allowances, they were able to actually make windfall profits from this regulation. So that's also something that the CBA would maybe be addressing, but also would create other issues in the same vein. Absolutely. Yes, please.
About the use of CBA, you mentioned that it will feed the own resources of the EU, but at the same time, EU aims at investing in new technologies in various sectors. So can we not consider that there is a back loop in order to increase the innovation capacity and productivity of these green technologies? And my question is, do you think that this is, how do we compare with other countries or with other first base?
So for the first part of the question, it's true that the EU will be investing in these technologies, but this is internally. And it does discuss in the regulation some elements where they will be trying to help diffusion. And so as I was discussing, diffusion is the main problem right now that's not obviously happening, and it's for several different reasons. So in that regard, there is some help for creating new technologies, but maybe not for transmitting them to unregulated countries, which is how the leakage channel would work. And then with regards to your second question, I'm not sure if I understood.
Comparison between EU policy in terms of investing in research versus other.
Sure, it's not a topic that I've specifically looked at. It's true that the EU has a lot of policies for investing in research. I'm not sure how it compares to other countries. I know that the US obviously is a leader in this domain just in terms of the money that's spent, but it's, yeah, point taken. Thank you. Yes?
How could this system adapt to products that are manufactured in many different countries, including some part of Europe?
Yeah, so that's...
How could this adapt also to services?
So the first question about how this can adapt to more complex products that have a lot of basic products and complex value chains is a big question, mostly in terms of technical expertise. It's the reason that for now it's only on really basic products, because we don't have an answer. The reasoning is that there will be maybe the development of this expertise by putting it first on primary products. There might be firms that are created and expertise that is developed within the EU to calculate carbon content. And this is already something that's happening, for example, for food products. There are firms that are starting to actually get this expertise and get this data, but it's something that's going to take time. And so hopefully with time and the development of this knowledge base, then it can be applied to more and more and more complex products. But right now, it's just not possible. And then for your second question about how it can be applied to services, I would argue that it's maybe the same thing, with the exception that services are even more complex. And it's the same thing where it's something, the data doesn't exist right now. And so first the primary data needs to be created, and that's through research and through the development of these things. But for now it's indeed not possible at all.
Okay, thank you. We will have to stop here and to switch to the second presentation.
Yeah, thank you all very much.